Welcome into a special edition of Next Level, where Greg Barnes and myself get into the weeds a little bit when we're talking about issues that affect North Carolina athletics, from the highest point to the lowest point. Highest point being the top of the food chain and down to the fan level. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. As always, we're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com and Congruity. And Greg, a lot of talk about the House settlement and how that's going to affect college athletics. And I want to first let you explain it from the beginning, because a lot of people that see House settlement think House of Representatives, United States Congress, and that's just simply not the case. Sort of start from the beginning and explain it for folks, and then we'll dig into it.
Well, that makes sense, the way that everybody kind of uses house settlement as shorthand for this whole situation. But essentially, once NIL took effect 3 years ago now, there have been other lawsuits that have kind of gone into play about how the NCAA handles compensation, whether or not that's allowed. And so, what the settlement is, it's bringing in three of the main lawsuits. That's House versus NCAA, Hubbard versus NCAA, and Carter versus NCAA. And because House is the first name there, that's what they call it, the House Settlement Agreement. And effectively, what they're trying to do is to address a lot of these concerns and set it up so that student athletes can receive not only some back payment within the statute of limitations, which in this case dates back to 2016, but also provide a foundation for revenue sharing moving forward. As everybody knows, TV money has just exploded throughout the sport really over the last 15 years. And with Brett Kavanaugh, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, kind of opening the door to like, hey, there's legitimate questions here. And if somebody's willing to take this to court, they could have some success potentially. Ever since he made those comments 3 years ago, that's what we've seen. And so that's what this settlement is trying to address. And earlier in the year, Judge Claudia Wilkin, who actually did the Alston case, which is a pretty big one, and of course the Ed O'Bannon case a number of years ago. So she has a lot of familiarity with this whole process. But she took an initial look at the agreement, recommended some changes, and then she took a look at it again in October and provided preliminary approval. So the expectation is we have a framework in place. There's some few I's to dot and T's to cross before all this is finalized. But the expectation is that come April, she likely will grant full approval, and then this will take effect in July, and this will kind of change things up. Everybody has really been focused on NIL and all these chaotic, wild, wild west type stories that we hear about kids who are averaging, a couple points a game and coming off the bench getting $2 million. This is kind of to address that, but it's also to handle some of the revenue sharing options moving forward to make this all equitable for everybody involved.
I guess the main thing, and one of my first questions to you would be, is how does this level the playing field, if it does, across, if we want to say the P4 level? I think, we're moving to a P2 and P3 level, but how does it level the playing field for all your quote unquote major universities in the major conferences, if it does?
Well, there's really two ways to kind of look at this in terms of how it levels the playing field. Number one, NIL is a concern that a lot of people have with people just throwing cash at kids, pay for play. And that's not how NIL was set up. NIL was set up to really be a commercial avenue where kids could come in and have sponsorship deals with people locally, maybe even regionally, and then if you're fortunate, a national brand. And that's how you could generate some money. And it really kind of strayed from that very quickly. And so what this, one of the things that this agreement has in place is the NCAA no longer will be making decisions on whether or not NIL contracts are legitimate. They really haven't been doing that anyway. That's really been left up to the school to work within the NCAA's framework. NCAA just does not have enough people on staff to be able to do that. And so there's going to be a third-party entity in play. And it's really going to be a clearinghouse type setup where if you sign an NIL deal that's valued at more than $600, then that contract has to go to this third party. Now, what I think a lot of people need to keep in mind is that this is still subjective when we're talking about the value of these contracts. I think one good example is, let's say, an ACC school is going to offer a kid $1 million to come play. Well, an SEC school may say, all right, we're going to offer him $1.2 million through this sponsorship program. Therefore, he's going to get more money. And this NIL clearinghouse may take a look and say, okay, wait a minute, well, why is $200,000 more? How do you arrive at that? And in that case, maybe the SEC school can say, look, we're in the SEC. We have larger viewership. This is the bigger area where people have more interest. That's where you get into the subjective nature of this. And that's where there's going to be a little bit of challenges. But I think more than anything, what this will address is some of the outliers. Where kids are just being thrown crazy money who don't deserve it, who aren't putting in any kinds of work with sponsorship. So it will address those components. But when you get into some of maybe the bigger names or those types of things is where it kind of gets a little, questionable in terms of how things are laid out. That's always going to be the case. And there's always going to be teams that bend the rules. Nothing's going to change with regard to that. So maybe that's just me being skeptical, but I think those of us who have followed college athletics for a long time understand that there are certain programs out there who want to win it at all costs. And there's enough of them that you're always finding ways to kind of bend the corners. The other component of this is when you get into revenue sharing. And this really does help to level the playing field, because what they've decided is that the formula that they've come up with is that when you take the average P4 school and you look at what that average revenue coming in is, well, then that's going to set the formula in place for what the expected revenue payout will be to student athletes. So it's 22%. And kind of the projections, Bubba Cunningham said in his letter on Wednesday that he thought it was going to be $20.5 million annually. Most of the projections that I've seen have been closer to 22 million, but somewhere in that range is kind of what you're looking at. And that's money that the school will get to decide, how you're going to divvy that up across your sports. Of course, the idea being that what you're going to do is provide the majority of that money to your revenue sports, being football and men's basketball. But beyond that, you have some leeway in how you want to split that up. I think one of the interesting things is when we talk about the back payment part of this, which is about $2.8 billion. Excuse me. The way that's designed is about 75% of that money will go to football, and then 15 to 20% goes to men's basketball, and then the other 5 to 10% goes to the Olympic sports. That's not set in stone for moving forward with the revenue sharing aspect of this thing. But I imagine that the SEC and the Big Ten will probably adhere to that approach. And then it's just a matter of what do all the other schools decide to do in allocating those money.
So there's some leeway school to school. But when you mentioned the back pay portion of it, explain that to people, because I do find this interesting. You mentioned statute of limitations 2016. It goes so athletes that played from 2016 on up. But what if I played in the 80s and I got a bad knee because I played? Am I out of luck, or is there an option for me?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're out of luck. And, statute of limitations don't go back that far. I think I believe it was 4 years. But I do think it's an interesting look into things. That we had somebody on the message board who said he played back in the 70s. And so I think it's an interesting question. So I went back and looked. And in 1978, according to the NCAA, the average Division I program generated $2.3 million in revenue. And when you apply inflation to that, that's about $11 million today. And we're talking about, North Carolina, for example, generated, roughly $135 million in 2022-23. So about 10 times what the revenue was 40 years ago. So even if you could go back in time, it's only a couple $1,000s that you would be benefiting anyway. But it really speaks to how much the media money has just exploded in recent years, and that's why this is all kind of blown up in the last several years.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, 50 cents and a cup of coffee was what you got back in the 70s.
Pat on
It's
the
not going
back.
to pay for a new. It's not going to pay for a new knee. You mentioned Bubba Cunningham in his comments earlier this week. Greg, where does North Carolina fall? He said he's committed to excellence across the board. North Carolina's got 28 sports, and several of which are national championship year in and year out caliber. Where does North Carolina fall in that? And how does all this affect all those other sports? Obviously, football and basketball are going to be a thing forever, but the other sports, is there any concern there with how this is all divvied out and how it may affect them?
There's always concern, and I think what people need to understand is that we've been talking a lot in recent years about a variety of things on this front, right? Conference realignment. What's the positioning for North Carolina to be able to generate the most revenue possible? And a part of that is that they knew revenue sharing was probably coming sooner than later, and that it was coming regardless. We've talked about the Smith Center, and people say, "Ah, you don't need to fix the Smith Center." Well, yeah, you do, and the reason that you do is that there's no suites of note in the
Mhm.
Smith Center, and that is a massive money driver. That's a lot of revenue there that you're missing out on. And so all these conversations that we've been having have been about generating revenue. And you're exactly right. If your only focus is football and men's basketball, there's really no need to have those conversations. Uh, Football is going to be just fine as a Power Four school, even in the ACC, is going to generate plenty of money to succeed. Men's basketball is one of the top programs in the country. They're not going to have any problems. But you've got 26 other Olympic sports, and so there's a determination from everybody involved that I've talked to that they do not want to have to cut sports if they can at all avoid it. And so a lot of the efforts taking place right now is to put North Carolina in a position where that's not really on the table. And you have to give the Rams Club a lot of credit. They've done an incredible job in raising funds to be able to establish a scholarship endowment, and that's really going to help because one of the other components of this, Tommy, is um, the revenue share is one part of it, the back payment's one part of it, but there's also a massive change with how the roster is set up and how you allot scholarships. Because while roster sizes are now going to shrink, Bubba Cunningham said his number right now is that there's going to be 115 fewer student athletes playing for North Carolina in the years to come, which is a big number, obviously. But on the flip side, on the positive side, you're going to have almost double the amount of scholarships potentially.
Yeah. Explain that because I think that's confusing people because you're going to go from 85 to 105 in football. The biggest one that most folks will notice is 11.7 to 35 in baseball, but yet roster sizes are shrinking. It's one of those. It doesn't meet the ear test when I hear it, but I understand it after looking deeper into it. Explain that to folks and how that's going to work.
Well, the whole idea there is that you want to kind of get costs under control, and you want to be able to provide scholarships to all roster spots. And so for so long, we really just focused on scholarship limits. Football is 85. Well, what a lot of people probably didn't know is that football teams can have 120 players. And so now you have this unique situation where instead of 85 scholarships available, you can actually give 105. And I thought it was interesting today, Ohio State, their athletic director suggested they may not even do the full 105, which I think there's a good argument that you don't necessarily need to do that. But you're also losing 15 roster spots. And so it's just really a different way that people kind of have to look at how these things play out. Basketball goes from 13 to 15, but you're going to have a cap at 15, so you're not going to be able to have all the additional walk-ons that maybe you would. And so it's just a unique change that really is unprecedented, something we haven't seen before. And it's going to take people a lot of time to kind of get accustomed to that. There's good things to it. There's also bad things to it. But it's really just a matter of trying to allocate scholarships to every roster spot. And then, I think it's important for people to understand that schools do not have to opt in to the house settlement. But if you take part in any type of NIL funding, then you automatically opt yourself in. So if you're opting out, you are 100% opting out. So major college sports teams will not be opting out because they don't really have a choice. But once you opt in, you're opting in for all your teams. Now, you do not have to provide scholarships for every single roster spot, but you are permitted to fund scholarships for every single roster spot. So how schools handle that puzzle is what's going to be interesting to see. And one of the key things with Bubba, as you mentioned, he's really stressed the importance of funding scholarships and supporting revenue sharing. Everything that we've been told is that UNC intends to be full rev share. So they're going to do up to that 22%, which is going to be the $20 to $22 million annually starting next year, which is going to make them competitive with every other school that's a big time player in college athletics. And that's a big part of this, because while everybody expects the SEC and the Big Ten to be full rev share, that may not be the case clearly with G5 schools, but it may not be the case with Big 12 and ACC schools as well, which will be very, very interesting to watch.
Yeah, I was going to stick this question in there, and it's in this same similar vein. If they average it out and it comes out to $22 million or whatever it is exactly, average, that means you would assume Texas would be way out here on the high end of that. But you've got other schools, you mentioned G5, that are lower. So if I opt in, I'm committed to 22 and a half or 22 that I have to pay out. How does that work for a school that opts in but is on the low scale of that? Because you're going to have somewhere in the mean, in the middle, and you've got high and low. How does that work for schools that are not making that much money?
Right. You don't have to go up to the full amount. That's what we talk about.
Okay.
Carolina is going to be full rev share. They intend to be full rev share. So they're going to intend to hit that benchmark of what the salary, if you want to call it a salary cap, you can, whatever it may be. That's the full rev share amount. That's the intention, is to be to that level. Now that's going to be separate than what the scholarships are. And I think that's important for people to understand. You can apply if you're doing new scholarships. So scholarships that you haven't provided before. If you're doing a bunch new ones, then you can count $2.5 million of that money towards the revenue sharing plan, but only $2.5 million. So any scholarships that you're providing above that 2.5 of new scholarships, that's coming out of a separate pot, which adds even more money to the mix, right? So that's going to be the question: is are there going to be schools? Let's say the ACC. Let's say what if there's a school that say, you know what, we can't do 22 million in rev share. We can do a little bit. How does that affect things in terms of the balance of haves and have-nots? And those are things that we're just going to have to wait and see how that plays out.
It's going to make conference realignment and getting those media markets and media shares even all the more important. We're talking about Greg Barnes here on The Next Level about, again, the new era of college athletics. Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com, our sponsors, and Congruity. Email matt@congruityhr.com for your free small to mid-sized business assessment. Greg, looking at it, I had a couple questions, but I did want to mention the Rams Club initiatives that they've had, and you can speak on them a little bit, but the Carolina Athletics Excellence, I'm terrible, Carolina Athletics Excellence Endowment and Carolina Athletics Excellent Fund, two different ways. You mentioned the scholarships. Scholarships, especially for out-of-state athletes, are ridiculously priced. You said that schools don't have to pay full, that you don't have to have 105 scholarships on the football team. But it seems like the Rams Club is making these initiatives out here to help push that and cover everybody. And I haven't even mentioned Title IX to you. So just sort of go there with what the Rams Club and what the school is trying to do to cover all these bases.
Yeah, and it's really gonna determine what the Rams Club and UNC as a whole decides that they want to fund in terms of the scholarships. I think it's important to note, as I mentioned, Rams Club has done a very good job in building their scholarship endowment. And you have a number of the Olympic sports because they've been so successful that you've got strong alumni bases within those programs. And they've done a pretty good job in raising money and funding scholarships for those programs. Now, there are some other programs that have some pretty big roster numbers coming up. Rowing is going to be a massive number. So that's part of the discussion is how much do you want to fund scholarships for a program like rowing? You mentioned baseball. You're going from 11.7 to 35 is a massive jump. But I think anybody that has followed any college baseball knows that 11.7 was a ridiculously low number. It's a silly number. It should have never been that. And so you're making up for lost time a little bit, but that is going to level the playing field quite a bit nationally. And that's really the juggling act that all these schools are going to have to go through, is sitting down and saying, okay, well, these are the sports that we know have a long history of success. We think there's path for success more so here than here. These other programs maybe don't have as much success. What can we do, and how do we want to shape the future in helping them succeed and having more success moving forward? And those are just the conversations that are going to be taking place in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, one thing Scott Forbes would always say to us when we interviewed him, he wanted to make sure that his players left school debt free and not having student loan debts and all that kind of stuff. This helps that 100% for these athletes, especially on the baseball side. I snuck Title IX in there, Greg. How does Title IX affect all this?
So I think it's a good question, and Title IX is prevalent, in college athletics. But I think what people need to understand, and until somebody tests this, probably in court, we may not have a true answer. But the way Title IX is set up, it's about opportunity. And as it applies to college athletics, is about making sure that there's you have roster spots available that kind of bridges both male and female numbers. You have financial assistance available for both, whether it be in Pell Grants, whether that be just in scholarships, whatever that may be. That's part of it, and then also benefits in terms of like facilities. Now, you don't have to have Kenan Stadium football level locker rooms for all the teams, but you need to have decent facilities set up that are somewhat equitable. That's the key thing with Title IX. When we start talking about rev share, well, rev share is about taking the money that specific programs make and sharing that with those student athletes. Every student athlete at North Carolina in the program that they're in, they have the opportunity to generate revenue for their programs. And whether or not that happens, that plays out on the field, and that plays out with media deals and those types of things. So I don't really see, from an initial look at it, I don't see how Title IX really plays a role into this. It's something clearly that everybody has to keep an eye on and really dive into and look into, make sure you're doing things correctly with the law. But just then, my look at it, and then talks with some people who have kind of had their hands in this for a while, I just don't see how Title IX is going to be that much of a factor with the rev share aspect of things.
Indeed, and we've talked about the school aspect. We've talked about student athlete aspect of it. Greg, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you how this affects the fans. I mentioned the Rams Club's initiatives. Those are on top of your Rams Club dues, according to what it says. We've talked about NIL. Folks have expressed frustration of having to pay players more than they make to play a sport at the school that they choose to pull for. So how, on the end of this, does all of this help or hurt the fan, the everyday fan? And I don't know if that's an easy question or a fair question, but how does it affect the everyday fan of these schools, whether you're an alum or whether you're just somebody that has grown up pulling for a school? How does that affect you?
Yeah, it is a good question, Tom. I don't know that we will have an answer to that until this takes shape. I do think it's very promising on the NIL side of things, that a third party clearinghouse is going to be implemented, and that there's going to be some attempt through arbitration when this third party kind of looks at these deals to make sure they're fair and to make sure that they're operating the way that they need to be operating. And it's not just going to be a cash grab like it's become the last couple of years. So for a program like North Carolina, the more boundaries and the more rules that are effective are in place, the better. Because Carolina is going to do things by the book. This is what they've always done. Um, and they may not have the fans that are willing to spend, however much money. And we talked about SMU, for example. I think this is a good example. When they were announced that they were coming to the ACC, in 1 year they had 4 donors that offered or provided $10 million or more in gifts, and then they had 35 $1 million plus gifts. That is crazy, crazy money. And not a lot of schools can match that. And so with these kind of guidelines in place and with this revenue sharing plan in place, for the large majority of schools, that's going to be beneficial because it levels the playing field. As we said, there's always going to be a handful of teams who do whatever they can to kind of skirt the rules and get an advantage. That's been going on for as long as we've been alive, Tommy, and that's going to continue to go on. So I don't know you can do anything about that, but I think from that standpoint, that's a positive for the fans. But you're exactly right. Now that revenue is going to the student athletes, and we're talking about $20+ million in the years moving forward, that wasn't previously going. That money has to be accounted for some way. Ideally, you get better media deals, and that covers a large segment of that. But fan support and donor support is a big part of this as well.
Indeed. So if you've got 10 million plus hanging around in oil money here in North Carolina, I'm sure UNC would enjoy it. SMU, we have seen how money matters. SMU in line to play for the ACC championship. Greg, anything else that I've missed asking you about? One thing I will mention to folks, if you haven't been on the Tar Pit Premium message boards or the UNC Basketball Premium message boards, there's a great thread. Greg's on there active, Ben Sherman as well, answering a ton of questions. But anything left here, Greg, that we can add to this?
Yeah, let's see. I think 2 things of note. One is, really the main thing is that people have asked, what happens if Judge Wilkin decides, what, after giving preliminary approval, she just decides in April that, what, we're not gonna do this. That's a possibility. So, what has happened? Mike DeWine, is it DeWine? I guess it's DeWine, the governor of Ohio. He signed an executive order earlier this week that allows universities in his state to go ahead and start doing the NIL compensation, paying for NIL compensation, setting that stuff up. That kind of matches what the House settlement is, just in case the House settlement doesn't go through. And the reason Ohio did that is because Georgia, Virginia, and Illinois have already done that. So we're going towards rev share regardless of whether or not the House settlement is actually approved. Everybody expects it to be approved. It's just a minor, it's just a matter of kind of getting to April and checking all the boxes. So that's that. And then the other thing is we had a couple questions about how NIL contracts will factor in. And somebody asked if they will be grandfathered in, the ones that are previously signed. When the House settlement takes effect, it takes effect in July, there's not going to be any option to grandfather any of those contracts in. And so what will have to happen is there will have to be a reworking, a renegotiating of those contracts. I know that North Carolina, for example, has some football contracts that run January to December. And so Carolina will have to make that decision when they sign, the contracts moving forward. Do you do maybe 6 months and have that contract length butt up with July and then start fresh? Do you go ahead and do a full 12-month contract like you normally do and have like a stipulation involved where it switches over to the university to handle things more so once the House settlement takes effect? So a lot of different working pieces like that still have to be ironed out. But everything's kind of moving in a streamlined fashion. And I think North Carolina has done a good job kind of getting ahead of it. I find it humorous that we focus so much of our energy on NIL, knowing that the settlement's coming. And NIL is still going to be impactful, but it's not going to be near the, I guess I can't say that, the mess that it has been the last couple years, starting next July.
This isn't a Sunday show. You could have
It's,
said it. I know what you meant.
yeah.
Let me ask you one last question. Are these deals going to ever be public between players and schools? We hear about so and so got 600,000, so and so got a million. Is there ever going to become a time where I know as Joe Public knows what Drake May made or what Drake May is being paid?
I think it's interesting. And Tommy, the reason that we didn't know, we haven't known previously, is because it's personal employment contracts. And initially, up until last April, the university, while they had to approve contracts to make sure they met compliance standards, they weren't looking at them in terms of dollar cost value and how it benefited the student athlete. They just wanted to make sure they were doing everything compliant with the rules. And so we were told that universities were not even keeping track of what all these dollar amounts were. Somebody knows, just because you have a market that's set. But now that with the House settlement, the universities will be more involved with the revenue share aspect of things. We're going to know how things are divvied up at some point. You may have to go through some Freedom of Information Act requests to get some details. But with NIL also kind of operating within that umbrella, does that mean that we're going to have more access to know exactly what those contracts are? Because if you want to know who anybody that works for the university makes, you can find that out pretty easy. Mm-hmm. And so we'll just have to wait and see exactly how those things play out. But we're going to be closer than we have been. At least put it like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can find out any state worker in the state of North Carolina. You can look up their salary, and you can look up coaches' salaries and all that. What you can't see is what all the extra incentives and the add-ons and all. So it's an interesting question. I've heard that a lot. Folks want to know what people make. I don't know if maybe I would yell at them more if I knew they made more or something. I don't know. But Greg, it's always a pleasure to talk this stuff. It seems like we could do one of these once a week and talk about something different, but I think we're getting closer to finally knowing what we're looking at here. And would you agree with that as we get out of here?
For sure. And I think that's what Bubba Cunningham did a good job of earlier this week with his letter to the fan base. This is kind of the foundation. This is the framework from which we're working. Now, everything's not finalized, and there's a lot of questions that they're still trying to hammer out. But I think as we get closer to the spring and Judge Wilkins' final decision, we'll be able to answer more of those questions. And so we'll know a lot more as we get closer to July and this thing kicks off.
Oh, July. There is no off season. Inside Carolina will be there covering it. Greg Barnes will be right on top of it as well. Johnny T-shirt and Congruity. Check out our sponsors. I'm Tommy. That's Greg. It's been next level. It's been all about money. I said it last night, all about the Benjamins. We'll find out more as we go along. Appreciate it, Greg.
Thanks, Tommy.